Historically, during the July Crisis, the Ottoman Empire attempted to make an alliance with France and Britain but were rejected. Then they tried with Germany and were initially rejected again. I would cover this a bit later, don't worry. At this point, the Ottoman Empire declared neutrality in this crisis, as they couldn't find any allies. So, what if the Ottoman Empire remained neutral in the Great War, seizing the Caucasus from Russia in 1918 like historically, during their civil war, but also getting to keep these territories this time around? In this alternate history, the Second World War would start and the Ottomans would be heavily Axis-leaning, which although would be a deeply unrealistic video, actually makes it really entertaining. Here's why. The Ottomans in this alternate history would control a lot of oil-rich territories. They can potentially open up another front against the British in the North African campaign, maybe kicking them out of Egypt and securing the Suez Canal for the Axis. Up north, the Ottomans already control the Baku oil fields, which they seized during the Russian Civil War, and this oil would greatly help Germany. As such, Operation Barbarossa may become more successful had the Ottomans remained neutral in the Great War and joined the Axis thereafter. So let me explore this crazy scenario in detail, and most importantly, would Germany win the Second World War in this alternate universe? Let me show you what I came up with. So, how do we get the Ottomans to remain neutral, and why did they even join the Great War on the side of the Central Powers in the first place? Here is how the story goes. Exactly when the Great War started, on the 28th of July 1914, Winston Churchill asked for Britain to seize two modern warships that were built in the Ottoman Empire by a British shipyard. This was accepted and the Ottomans even paid for these ships, but they never used them as they were taken by Britain, which alienated the pro-British elements in the Ottoman Parliament, pushing the country more towards Germany. Enver Pasha, who I would say is the most prominent figure in the Ottoman Empire, was very much pro-German and wished to join the war on their side. He knew that the Ottomans would lose these two ships, so he tried to sell them to Germany instead of Britain, but this didn't work. So the Ottomans were very pissed at Britain for taking the ships that Ottoman citizens had paid for. The German government capitalized on this anger and offered SMS Gioben and SMS Breslau to the Ottoman Navy as a replacement for the ships that Britain had seized, as a way for Germany to get influence in Constantinople. At this point, the British and Germans were at war, so Britain chased these two German warships in the Mediterranean Sea, but the Ottoman Empire violated their neutrality and allowed them to pass the Dardanelles Straits, rather than for them to be sunken by the Royal Navy. The Ottoman Empire tried to maintain their neutrality by stating that they wanted to purchase these ships as a replacement, hence why they were allowed to enter the Dardanelles, but the British ones weren't. These two German ships were eventually gifted to the Ottoman Empire, but the German crew continued to operate them as usual, just under a different flag. What this means is that these ships were no longer at war, but rather part of the neutral Ottoman Empire. As Enver Pasha wanted to join the war on the side of the Central Powers, he had to get creative, because the people absolutely didn't want any more war. Mind you, at this point the Ottomans had lost their war to Italy, losing Libya and the Deccanese Islands, but also the First Balkan War, where they were almost kicked out of Europe. The Ottomans were extremely exhausted, so most people preferred peace for the time being. So, as a result of that, Enver Pasha had a genius idea to join the war, and to not alienate his people, and this was to provoke Russia to declare war on him. Mind you, he acted on this in secret, and when the ministers of his cabinet had found out, they even tried to oust him from power. Just 2.5 months after the start of the Great War, exactly these German-operated ships under the banner of the neutral Ottoman Empire bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea, bringing the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers, as Russia declared war on them, and Enver Pasha rallied his people, claiming that Russia was the aggressor. So, what exactly caused the Ottoman Empire to join the Great War? Well, I think it's overwhelmingly clear that this is Enver Pasha, as he would have found another excuse to enter the war on the side of Germany, even if the earlier mentioned ships weren't allowed to enter the Ottoman territorial waters. This is because Enver Pasha had served as an attaché in the German army before the war, where he saw how powerful the German army actually was, and assumed that Germany would win in an upcoming conflict easily, hence why he wanted to side with them and be on the winning side. He even believed that if Germany is defeated, then nothing would stop France, Britain and Russia from colonizing the Ottomans later on. So he thought that Germany was going to win and that the Ottomans would have been partitioned if they didn't join their side. This is why I believe that if he is still in charge, he would inevitably bring the Ottoman Empire at war with the Entente. The follow-up question is, what made Enver Pasha come to power in the first place? Well, this is the Committee of Union and Progress, the party ruling the Ottoman Empire practically as a dictatorship ever since 1913 as a result of the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. Getting rid of this political party would be a great start to keep the Ottomans out of the war, as there were already two prominent unsuccessful coups that we can use to achieve this. I want to go back to the year of 1908, just 6 years before the outbreak of the Great War, so I can tell you how the Young Turks took power, and now you know that this eventually led to Enver Pasha to bring the Ottomans into the war. For some context, Sultan Abdulhamid II was ruling the Ottoman Empire as an absolute monarchy, and the Young Turks absolutely opposed it greatly. They wished for more modernization, secularization and centralization. As such, from their stronghold in Thessaloniki, they marched on Constantinople and forced Sultan Abdulhamid II to restore the 1876 constitution and the Ottoman parliament. This constitution was more liberal and more European-like, but historically it was suspended just 2 years after it was adopted due to the Russo-Turkish War of 1878. But after the war it was never reintroduced, allowing Sultan Abdulhamid II to rule with absolute power for the next 30 years. As I just mentioned, the Young Turks succeeded in this and called for new elections as to legitimize their rule. There, their political party, Committee of Union and Progress, which I would just call CUP from now on, didn't win a majority right away, but was still the largest political party in the Ottoman parliament. Most of the candidates of this parliament ran as independent, and later on they allied with the CUP and formed a grand coalition. In the end, this is how the seats look like, divided by a nationality of the members of the Ottoman parliament, and the Turks just had a narrow majority of 3 seats. Further, Germany initially supported the CUP in 1908 and invested into the Ottomans. Alright, so these are great reforms. The Ottoman Empire becomes more democratic, reforms, gets investments. It's all good, right? Well, you already know the answer, don't you? Many Islamists, conservatives and loyalists to the Sultan hated these changes, so on the 31st of March 1909 they launched a coup d'etat against the Young Turks. Sultan Abdulhamid II pretended to sympathize with the rebels, in hopes of restoring his absolute power again. When the Young Turks recovered Constantinople, Sultan Abdulhamid II was forced to abdicate, in favor of his brother Mehmed V, who was serving as a figurehead with no power. By the way, at this point Russia considered sending troops in Constantinople as to help the revolution and for Sultan Abdulhamid II to remain in power, but this never happened, yet it could create for some really interesting alternate history scenarios in the future. Subscribe to the channel to show me that you want to see this scenario, or if you have generally liked any of my videos, as it would help me make even more and better. Thank you in advance. This is one way we can have the CUP to be ousted from power and for Enver Pasha to literally not kill the entire empire by single-handedly making a faulty decision. The thing is that at this point, the CUP were not problematic and not running the country as a dictatorship compared to 4 years later in 1913. When the Ottoman Empire lost their war to Italy in 1912, the CUP's popularity dipped greatly, so the military started plotting to overthrow the government. In 1912 there was another election, where the main parties were the CUP, which was pro-German, anti-Armenian and anti-minority, and the other party was Freedom and Accord Party, which was pro-British. Here it is said that the CUP employed electoral fraud and violence to gain 269 out of the 275 seats. And this is really important. The CUP is becoming slowly more authoritarian and eventually became what they swore to destroy, authoritarianism. This chaos only worsened, as in January 1912 the savior officers actually succeeded in their coup and overthrew the CUP, making the Ottoman Empire run by the military once more. In October of 1912 the First Balkan War had started and the Ottoman Empire had lost it once again. So, well, the CUP did a counter coup on the 23rd of January 1913, almost exactly a full year after they were forced out of power. There they violently took over power again and established a military dictatorship under the 3 Pashas. At this point the CUP became worse than their previous government. It is said that this is the turning point where the CUP saw that military force could be used to resolve domestic politics, which was later sadly used against the Armenians. To summarize, when the Great War broke out, the Ottoman Empire had already been at war 3 different times for a total of 3 years. They had a new government in 1908, led by the Young Turks. A revolution that was crushed, the savior officers took power after them, then the Young Turks deposed them and took power again, which is 5 different governments in the span of 5 years, in addition to all the wars. This perhaps could explain why the Ottomans performed the way they did in the Great War. Not only that, but the CUP initially was pro-German, but after Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia during the 1908 Bosnian crisis, the CUP switched to wanting to work with Britain instead. After the Balkan Wars and shortly before the July Crisis, the CUP was convinced that only an alliance with Britain and the Entente could guarantee the survival of what remained of the empire. Initially, the Ottoman government, especially Minister of State Tawat Pasha, was advocating for siding with the British, but the British had declined this offer. After 1913 and the CUP taking full control of the nation, they were set on their path of joining the war and on the side of the Central Powers. So here is how we can change this, and I think that the key is in the 1912 coup that deposed the CUP to be more successful, while the following 1913 coup where the CUP reclaimed power to fail. This is the only way for the Ottomans to remain neutral in the Great War, unless we want Russia to land in Constantinople in 1909, but this could be a topic for another video. So here is what I would change, considering all the context I just gave you. I think that the 1912 coup d'etat should have been delayed by almost a year. The reason for this is that when historically the CUP was deposed and Ahmed Muhtar Pasha took charge, about 2 months after that the First Balkan War had started, where the Ottomans had lost the war and in turn the new government, paving the way for the CUP to do a counter coup and take charge again. Here everything I would change is simply timing, although it may be more so on the unrealistic side. I would suggest that the anti-CUP military officers that would carry out the coup d'etat be a bit more patient, they would wait and organize more. When the First Balkan War would start in this alternate history, it would be the CUP running the country this time, which means that the inevitable Ottoman defeat would be blamed into them rather than the savior officers. Then the Freedom and Accords Party and their supporters would carry out the coup like historically, which would see a lot more support due to more preparations by them and the CUP losing almost everything in Europe. This means that the CUP would still be deposed and Ahmed Muhtar Pasha would take charge of the nation like historically, but this time it is likely here to last. There would be snap elections in 1913, where the Freedom and Accords Party would take the lion's share of the votes, and this party favored siding with the Entente, and this is the key for the Ottomans to remain neutral. Really quickly, I want to mention the Second Balkan War. Historically, the CUP was leading the Ottomans during this war, so they invaded Bulgaria as to regain lost territories, which bolstered their popularity. This time with the Freedom and Accords Party, which I would simply be calling the Liberals, are now leading the Ottoman Empire, but I think that they still might intervene in Bulgaria. This is because of the city of Adrianople, which was very important to the Ottomans as Verdun was to the French, and it was taken by Bulgaria in the First Balkan War. I think that the Liberals are likely to oppose intervening in Bulgaria and taking so much of their land, but they are definitely at least going to want to reclaim Adrianople. In the end, Bulgaria would still be defeated in the Second Balkan War, but the Ottomans would take slightly less territory than historically. This greatly bolsters the legitimacy and popularity of the Liberal Party. During the July Crisis over the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, German diplomats would still offer the Ottomans an anti-Russian alliance, as well as territorial gains in the Caucasus, northwestern Iran and Transcaspia, but the ruling Liberal Party was leaning towards Britain, so they would refuse to take part of this. Historically, the pro-British faction in the cabinet was isolated because the British ambassador in Constantinople had taken leave until the 18th of August, which was a very unfortunate timing, meaning that historically the Ottomans couldn't negotiate directly with Britain. If we were to change this as well, then the Ottomans can strike a deal with the British. The thing is that the Ottomans were unaware that the British might enter the European war due to their secret guarantees of Belgian independence, which by the way a sizable amount of the British parliament didn't even know existed, so the Ottomans just assumed that Britain would stay out of the war, hence why the Ottomans wanted to be on good terms with them. As the crisis deepened and war was looking inevitable in Europe, the Ottomans didn't want to do anything with it, so here in this alternate history they would only negotiate with both parties as to preserve their territorial integrity, rather than on whose side to join. Mehmed V, the constitutional monarch of the Ottoman Empire, actually wanted to not get involved in the war, which views would also be shared by the pro-British Liberal Party, when Britain inevitably enters the war. The people of the Ottoman Empire also didn't want war, as they were already devastated by 3 different wars in just 3 years, so almost everybody in the Ottoman Empire in this alternate history wanted the same, peace. Further, the geographical location of the Ottoman Empire meant that Russia, France and Britain had a mutual interest in the Ottomans' neutrality in a European war, as they didn't want to fight on 2 or potentially 3 more fronts, or actually even 4, but rather for all of them to focus on Germany and Austria-Hungary. This was an insanely long introduction, but I believe we have set up the Ottoman Empire for neutrality. Sure, the British would still demand their 2 warships from the Ottoman shipyards, which would antagonize the pro-British elements of the government like historically, but I think this would push the Ottomans more into neutrality, rather than to go with their enemy of Germany. As for the German ships that historically were gifted to the Ottomans and eventually showed the Russian cities on the Black Sea, they would never be allowed to enter the Dardanelles Strait with this alternate Ottoman government, so they're likely called by the British. By 1914 there were definitely ethnic tensions in the empire, but the thing is that the Liberal Party is now in charge, so there is a functioning not-rigged parliament, and most importantly the Liberal Party pushed for more decentralization and autonomy. In stark contrast, the CUP wanted the Turks to dominate the empire and centrally govern it from Constantinople and for all the minorities to be marginalized, while the liberals wanted a multi-ethnic federal structure where they would allow their minorities more self-governance. I think that this would calm many of the protests in the Ottoman Empire, and now the empire is becoming what the CUP originally wanted, free from oppression. So, with the Ottoman Empire remaining neutral in the Great War, what exactly would change? Well, to put it simply, almost everything. First up, after the First Balkan War, there historically was a refugee crisis of hundreds of thousands of Turks and Muslims from Balkan countries going to the Ottoman Empire. This time these people would be better cared for and the Ottomans would improve internally, instead of participating in another war. As to mention the other changes, Britain is now not fighting in the Suez Canal, Kuwait and supporting the Arab rebels, but also land in Gallipoli, as the Ottomans likely strike a deal with Entente, where they wouldn't interfere in their internal politics and the Ottomans would remain neutral. Russia isn't fighting on a second front in Anatolia, which would free up a lot of their forces and their co-ops may be delayed. Also, the Liberal Party of the Ottoman Empire is unlikely to brutally murder millions of Armenians, so this would be prevented as well. What we can deduct from all of this is that the Entente has millions more soldiers focused on Germany and Austria-Hungary. At this point, Bulgaria refusing to join the Central Powers is not too impossible to happen. Historically, Bulgaria joined because they believed in the Central Powers could win, plus they promised them a lot more land. The thing is that by the time Bulgaria joined the Great War, the Ottoman Empire was already fighting alongside Germany for almost an entire year. Historically, when Bulgaria joined, Serbia was quickly destroyed and there was a land bridge from Germany to the Ottomans. This wouldn't exist in this alternate history, as if Bulgaria were to join the war on the side of the Central Powers, they are likely very isolated, plus the situation is a lot different than historically. Germany and Austria-Hungary are fighting against Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, France, the United Kingdom and Italy. Japan is also involved, but their participation doesn't change anything in Europe. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the odds are heavily stacked against the Central Powers, plus Greece and Romania are leaning toward joining the Entente, while Portugal was also allied with Britain, and even don't get me started on the United States. Basically, I think that Bulgaria would see the writing on the wall and decide to remain neutral for the time being, as they had just lost a massive war fighting against all of their neighboring countries, and if they decided to join the Central Powers, they could suffer the same fate. The Entente would still promise Bulgaria parts of Macedonia and to diplomatically resolve issues in the Balkans, which can potentially sway the Bulgarians to the side that is winning and willing to give them land. Again, as a Bulgarian, you may say that I'm biased, so I'd like to hear some arguments in the comment section as to why what I said is unreasonable if you hold this position. By the way, I think that Italy might join the war ever so slightly later, as here the Ottoman Empire is not going to join the war, so the Entente wouldn't promise the Italian zones of control in Anatolia, but this could be for the better, as historically Italy after the war felt mutilated and betrayed for never getting these lands, so perhaps ultranationalism in Italy is less popular after the war, but I would get to this a bit later. Another change we can see is in Greece, where there is perhaps no national schism due to Germany being drastically weaker. The supporters of Eleftherios Venizelos wanting to join the Entente are likely less popular as well, so I can see Greece to remain neutral, but heavily leaning towards the Entente. The Ottoman Empire now being neutral means that France and Britain can supply Russia with food and war materials via the Dardanelles Straits, which would work even better in their favor. I think that this would snowball greatly into the Entente's favor, as Serbia never capitulates. France would win the Battle of Verdun more easily due to hundreds of thousands of British soldiers not being preoccupied in the Suez, Hejaz, Iraq and Gallipoli combined, so they can help France out in the Western Front. Russia is also now supplied better, as their Anatolian army could be used to launch the Brusilov offensive or something similar, while Serbia is still standing and never capitulating, which would see even more success. The thing is that France would win the Battle of Verdun easily, so they wouldn't call for the Russians to do a massive offensive to distract Germany, but I think that the Russian offensive into Austria-Hungary would be inevitable, but the exact timing would be impossible to predict. Romania would join the war after such an offensive like historically, but with Bulgaria either being neutral or joining their side, they wouldn't capitulate right away, so Austria is now fighting and losing on almost all fronts. I don't think I need to stretch this out any longer, the Central Powers are still losing, but a lot sooner. We can assume that Germany would still do the Zimmermann telegram and unrestricted submarine warfare even sooner, as they would be even more desperate, bringing America into the war against them. By early to mid-1917, I think that Austria-Hungary would reach a boiling point. They never got Serbia capitulated, lost Galicia to Russia, lost parts of Transylvania to Romania, and in this alternate history they wouldn't even take parts of the Venetian province from Italy. They are just slowly and steadily collapsing, so they may be the first to break, which I think would lead to Germany to surrender shortly after. Russia in this alternate history never capitulated, but this doesn't mean that there are no internal issues. I would cover them a bit later on. For now, this is how the peace treaty would look like, and I would apply the one we got historically and adjust a few borders. First up, since the war was shorter, I think that Germany would be punished less harshly. I think that they would get to keep northern Schleswig and Danzig, including the corridor. Also, perhaps the German army is less restricted and the war reparations are lower, which could help Germany recover faster and having a better chance to avoid ultranationalism. Hey, maybe even the monarchy remains in charge, but with a pro-British Wilhelm III instead. Austria-Hungary, I bet, would collapse in the same way as historically. While in the Balkans, Bulgaria may be compensated with parts of Macedonia, the western outlands, and maybe northern Dobruja, but the latter I don't think is too possible, so I would disregard it. Do note that it's obviously impossible to predict the exact peace treaty, so Hungary may get to keep a bit more territory, or Austria could remain Habsburg, just a lot smaller. Anything is possible here, but I would go with the mostly historic borders. Finally, with the Ottoman Empire, I honestly don't think that a lot will change for them in terms of territory, at least right away, so this is how Europe would look like after the war. By the way, the German colonies are partitioned like historically, I don't see a reason for this not to happen. Now the Ottoman Empire has reformed, but it's not like everything has been magically fixed. They still suffer from the same internal issues as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was being multi-ethnic. Even Russia would have similar problems that could cause a civil war there, despite them winning the Great War. So all of the issues in the Ottoman Empire are not resolved automatically. The difference between Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans is that there simply wasn't a war for the Ottomans to fight that they would expose their weakness and lead for them to collapse. For now the empire is holding on, but barely. I want to go in detail regarding what would actually change in this alternate history, where of course most of the changes would be in the Ottoman Empire rather than in Europe, which is more or less the same, barring Russia, which I would cover a bit later in the video. I don't think that most people realize the immense difference between the Ottoman Empire in let's say 1920 and Turkey in 1930, as the society had completely transformed due to the reforms of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. In this alternate history, he is still a well-respected general in the army, but he never rises to power to implement said reforms. For example, the Ottoman Empire was using the Arabic alphabet, which Atatürk changed with the Latin alphabet, trying to make the country more modern and western. Then, as most of the population was illiterate either way, there was a great effort of educating the people to read and write in the new alphabet, and re-educating the ones who already knew how to read and write but in Arabic. The Gregorian calendar also replaced the Islamic lunar calendar, and this I would say is a big deal. The year of the Gregorian calendar starts with the approximate birth of Jesus Christ, while in the Islamic calendar it starts with the migration of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE. This is why the current year in many Islamic countries is 1447, while in Christian ones it's 2025, but Turkey became an exception with these reforms. The fez, one of the biggest Ottoman symbols, was also banned and men were encouraged to wear suits instead. Women's rights were also improved, as they were allowed to vote much earlier than most of the Balkans, France, Switzerland and Italy. Further, Turkey was the first Muslim country to do that. Women got equal rights as men when it came to education and so on, but also inheritance. The Ottoman Caliphate was also abolished with these new reforms, and there was a separation from church and state, which was theoretically done in the Ottomans decades prior, but was actually never enforced. Sharia law was also prohibited in Turkey with these reforms by Atatürk, in addition to Quranic verses being removed from government buildings, and religious holidays were demoted and replaced with national holidays. Also, Constantinople was renamed to Istanbul at this point in time. All of these reforms happened in the span of about 10 years, completely transforming the Turkish society, and all of this would simply never happen here. The Ottoman Empire still exists, the Caliphate is still strong, the people are still mostly illiterate and use Arabic. They use the Islamic calendar and women's rights are mostly non-existent. Simply put, the Ottoman Empire wouldn't reform in the same way and speed as Ataturk managed to achieve it historically. While they would definitely improve in some areas, I doubt that the empire will change the alphabet to Latin, considering how many Arabs actually reside there. Historically, it may have been easy for the Turkish portion, which was a separate country, to achieve it, but now this is not the case. Many of the greatest reforms by Ataturk wouldn't be seen in this alternate history. The Ottomans would modernize, but more slowly. Another change is that there would be no Greco-Turkish War, as it only happened after the Ottomans were defeated in the Great War, but also no Turkish War of Independence. You may say that avoiding these two wars would be beneficial, and it very well could be, but there are some positives of the Greco-Turkish War for both sides, like the mutually agreed population exchange. Now millions of Greeks would still reside in the Ottoman Empire, and millions of Turks would reside outside of it, so the Balkans would become more dense, I could imagine. In the 1920s, I would assume that many minorities in the Ottoman Empire would be pushing either for independence or more autonomy, as the Ottoman parliament would still be very much more Turkish biased. The problem is that I don't think that the Ottomans could still federalize the empire, as most of the governors preferred for it to be centrally governed, but for the non-Turks to have some autonomy. At this point, predicting anything in detail would be impossible, but I want to make these scenarios interesting as possible, so I want to let you know that I would be nuking the fridge, and the scenario from this point onwards would become very unrealistic, but it perhaps could be one of my most entertaining videos I have ever made. If you're looking for a realistic video, you can stop watching here. Now let me go over to Russia, which I still think could have a civil war, as it was caused not only by the lack of military victories in the Great War, but mainly due to food shortages and general discontent with Nicholas II and his absolute rule. Something akin to a February Revolution is guaranteed to happen, and Kerensky might still come in charge, but the communists I would imagine would become even more popular this time around. This is because Russia's victory in the Great War actually caused more problems than it was worth, so everybody in the empire would have it worse than before the war, hence why I think that the anti-war slogans of the communists could attract plenty of support. I assume that the Russian Civil War would still happen, as I want to make these scenarios interesting as possible, and this time the Czechoslovak Legion is not stuck in the Trans-Siberian Railroad, aiding the Whites, so I think that the Reds could be in a more favorable position to win. With this revolution, Poland and Finland would break away almost immediately, while the Baltics would do the same a bit later. Of course, the British and French did historically aid White Russia, which I can see happening here as well, but like historically, perhaps this is not enough, as White Russia was very disorganized and didn't have clear plans as to what to do in case of a victory. There was no united leadership, goals and ideas. Perhaps this is very unrealistic, as the Great War was slightly shorter and the Entente was in a stronger position, suffering less casualties and destruction, so they can spare a lot more to send to White Russia, but for the sake of this video I would assume that the Reds will still win the Civil War, as this would make it even more interesting. Britain historically wanted the Caucasus to remain independent and not in the hands of the communists, but the British lacked the funds to support their cause. Thankfully for them, the Ottomans would have semi-decent relationship with Britain, so they could do the heavy lifting there, where a mountain protectorate could be established, almost directly being in the Ottoman sphere of influence. Everything in Russia would end basically in the same way, but the Ottomans would get to keep the Caucasus this time around. Italy, as I mentioned in the peace treaty part of the video, was never promised zones of control in Anatolia, so they perhaps feel less mutilated by their allies. Still, the rise of ultranationalism there was caused mostly because of the dire economic situation, and the countless lives lost during the Great War. I can still see the March on Rome to happen, but let's say this time it would be 3 years later, so in 1925. Germany on the other hand has got to keep some minor territories, more so than historically, so they can access East Prussia directly and have the Danzig corridor. So the ultranationalists there would find it rising to power ever so slightly more difficult, as this was one of their main talking points. Still, I would say that this is inevitable, especially after the 1929 Great Depression, which would almost destroy the Weimar Republic like historically. For the sake of this video, I made Germany to continue be a monarchy, headed by Wilhelm III, who was somewhat sympathetic to the ultranationalists, and more specifically this guy, as they took some pictures together in our own history. Historically, the Austrian painter even had verbal promises that he would put Wilhelm III in charge when he takes power, but this never happened. In this alternate history, I would make Wilhelm III to appoint the Austrian painter as a prime minister, who would later take over the country and keep the monarchy as a symbolic gesture, like how Victor Emmanuel was kept around in Italy, but Mussolini and his government had the real power. This way, Germany still goes ultranationalist around the same time as historically, despite them retaining a bit more land, all thanks to Wilhelm III. As to mention the Ottomans really quickly, the Great Depression would still hit them hard, but the discovery of so much oil on their territory I think would prevent total collapse. Still, most of their resources would be spent fighting rebellions, rather than actually improving, so the Ottomans are in a state of limbo, where they're in more or less the same position internally, continuing fighting rebels. I can see the British to invest in the Ottoman Empire and potentially establish an oil company there, which much like Iraq and Iran historically would be very exploitative to the local people, and most of the oil profits would go to Britain. This would be seen as the seed of resentment towards the English that would start to grow in the interwar period in the Ottoman Empire. From here, the build-up to the Second World War would be more or less the same. Germany would get the Saarland via referendum, Italy would invade Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War would still happen, Japan would invade China, Germany would annex Austria, then the Sudetenland, then the entire Czechoslovakia is partitioned, then they take Memel, and then, well, they already have Danzig, so would they attack Poland right away, or would they just strike west? Well, I think that Germany would still attack Poland first, but would have to make up a new casus belli. It could be that the German minorities in Poland are mistreated, or that Poland is acting aggressively, or Germany could initiate a border incident, but I think they're attacking Poland first. The reason for this is because Germany didn't want to fight a war on two fronts, which was them the Great War historically. As such, the ultranationalist Germans believe that they can get Poland out of the way and sign a treaty of non-aggression with the Soviets and partition the country, and for Germany to focus west, so Poland would have to go. They are still invaded, overrun and partitioned like historically. Operation Veserilbung and the fall of France I think would happen in the same way, while the consolidation of the Balkans would be altered ever so slightly, considering the Ottoman Empire is a big player there, but I cannot know exactly. Germany used to occupy the Greek Aegean Islands, which they could use as a bargaining chip to bring the Ottoman Empire into the war onto their side. Germany could also promise them Cyprus, all of Arabia, and most importantly of all, literally all of Central Asia. For the purpose of this video, we could assume that the Liberal Party in the Ottoman Empire would lose their majority in favor of a more expansionist party that is strongly anti-communist and anti-British due to their exploitation of the Ottoman resources and public resentment. I would have the Ottoman Empire to seize the British oil wells in their territory, which could trigger a diplomatic crisis there, serving as a casus belli for the Ottomans to join the war against Great Britain sometime in 1940, after the consolidation of the Balkans. Here, Germany immediately hands over the Greek Aegean Islands to the Ottomans, which would be annexed by the Ottoman Empire, bolstering their morale temporarily and immediately after joining the war. Now let us look at the North African campaign, and as you can see, Britain is now going to fight on two fronts, with the Ottomans being very near the Suez Canal, where I can see the German elite divisions, likely the ones that were used to land in Crete, to do a similar operation and take the Suez Canal, while Rome would push from the west and win in the Battle of Al Alamein. Britain would now be on the run, but I think that it will only get worse for them. The Ottoman Caliphate is still the global Islamic symbol, which I think would be used to influence Muslims throughout the world to rise up against the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. This is a big deal, as Free France would see many unrest in their colonies, while Britain would see the same, but to an extremely large magnitude. Muslims in the British Raj would rise up in arms against the British oppressors, and I don't think that this is too unrealistic. This is because even in the Great War historically, Indian and Pakistani Muslims silently supported the Ottoman Empire, despite being part of the Entente British. Britain would also see rebels in Egypt and potentially as far as Malaysia, so you can imagine this would heavily tip the scale into the Axis favor. Further, the Ottoman Empire controls so much oil that Germany could choose to fuel their war machine. British bases in Kuwait, Oman and the United Arab Emirates would be quickly seized, which means that there would be no way for Britain to destroy these Ottoman oil fields in the Arabian Peninsula, giving the Axis an impenetrable, near-infinite supply of oil. At this point, Germany would invade the Soviet Union, but remember, the Soviets don't have the oil in the Caucasus, which was taken by the Ottomans during their civil war. Now the Ottomans would open up a second front against the Bolsheviks, putting them in a worse situation than historically, especially since their civil war in the Sultanate history could have been more destructive due to more French and British support for the Whites. Here Germany advances quickly, this time not suffering any oil shortages, but supply is of course still a massive issue. The Red Army is still disorganized and weakened by the Great Purge. The situation is very dire. At this point, I think that near the end of 1941, perhaps in October, that Germany could actually capture Moscow. There is a saying that Stalin wouldn't have left the city, so if this is true, then Germany would capture him as well, beheading the snake. the Soviet Union would be scrambling, and with their oil situation being even more reduced, they would undoubtedly be weaker than historically. Even further, Iran likely doesn't fall to the Allies, as the Ottomans to the west and the Muslim rebels to the east would practically surround Iran, making it difficult for the British and the Soviets to partition them and establish the corridor like historically. A sizable amount of the Lend-Lease that was sent to the Soviets arrived exactly from here, so it would have to arrive in the Far East, which would take a while to reach the front lines. Plus, the Lend-Lease only started to pick up in 1943 and 1944, where in the previous 2 years it was almost nothing worthwhile. Call me crazy, but I think that the Axis could win this war, even though we have obviously sacrificed a lot of realism there, which would be evident with the Ottomans still being around. The situation is that Britain has lost the North African campaign, the Soviet Union has lost Moscow, plus perhaps maybe Stalin as well, and them losing Leningrad and Stalingrad is looking increasingly more likely. While the Muslims in India are in an open revolt, allowing for Japan to capture more of the country there, and be more uncontested in Southeast Asia, where they historically occupied most of it. Sure, America would be in the war and they would eventually develop nukes that would drop on Germany this time around, but if the Soviet Union and India fall to the Axis occupation, then I think that this would be the end for the war either way, making Britain and America have to sign a peace treaty. For the sake of this video, let us assume that this is the case and peace would be signed. I already made a video series where the Axis are victorious, so I would just copy these maps as a template, but make a few key changes, mostly in the Middle East. Here I can see the Ottomans to gain parts of western Iran that had the Azeri majority, perhaps the Khuzestan province as well, just to make sure that all the Kurds and the Arabs are inside of their territory, plus get even more oil, while the Ottomans fully consolidate the Arabian Peninsula. The rest of the peace treaty would be a standard Axis victory scenario, except that in Central Asia, the Muhammad Reich that would be established in the area would become part of the Ottoman Empire, where I can see a land bridge to form between the two. At the expense of a lot of realism, we managed not only to save the Ottoman Empire, but also make them expand greatly, but most importantly for them to defeat their centuries-old rival of Russia. If you enjoyed this video, I would suggest that you take a look at this one regarding the Axis winning the Second World War, and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.